Hello, my name is Jake. I'm 32. I work as a carpenter, mostly doing custom cabinets and furniture restoration in my small workshop downtown. I never thought I'd be sitting in a college classroom again, but here I was, 3 months into an evening literature course at the community college, trying to figure out what the hell I was doing with my life. The thing about being a carpenter is that you work with your hands all day, creating something tangible, something real. But lately I'd been feeling like there was something missing, some part of me that needed feeding. My ex-girlfriend Lisa used to say I was too practical, that I never let myself explore the creative side that she swore was buried somewhere inside me. Maybe that's why I signed up for Professor Emma's Introduction to Creative Writing class. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself. Or maybe I was just tired of coming home to an empty apartment and a half-finished bookshelf. The classroom was one of those old-fashioned ones with tall windows and fluorescent lights that hummed constantly. 23 other students, most of them at least a decade younger than me, sat in those uncomfortable plastic chairs that seemed designed to make you want to leave early. I usually sat in the back corner, close to the door, partly because I liked having an escape route, and partly because I felt like I didn't quite belong with all these kids who talked about their blogs and their poetry slams. Professor Emma was different from what I'd expected when I signed up. She was probably in her early 30s, with dark hair that she usually wore pulled back, and these intense brown eyes that seemed to see right through whatever facade you were trying to maintain. She had a way of asking questions that made you think about things you'd never considered before. When she talked about character development, or the way a single sentence could change the entire meaning of a story, she got this look on her face like she was sharing some kind of sacred secret. Tonight's class had been about dialogue, about how people reveal themselves not just through what they say, but through what they don't say. We'd spent an hour dissecting a short story by Raymond Carver, picking apart the silences between words, the weight of unspoken thoughts. I found myself thinking about all the conversations I'd had with Lisa toward the end, how we'd both been saying everything except what we actually meant. As class ended and students began packing up their notebooks and laptops, I started gathering my things quietly. I developed this routine over the past few weeks of being one of the first ones out the door, not because I didn't enjoy the class, but because I felt awkward hanging around afterward. These younger students would cluster around Professor Emma's desk, asking questions about assignments or chatting about books I'd never heard of. I didn't want to intrude on that world, and I certainly didn't want to look like some older guy trying too hard to fit in. I slipped my notebook into my worn leather messenger bag, the one I'd had since college the first time around, 15 years ago. The zipper caught slightly the way it always did, and I had to jiggle it to get it closed. By the time I looked up, most of the other students had already filed out, their voices echoing down the hallway as they discussed weekend plans and upcoming assignments. Perfect, I thought. I could make my exit without any awkward small talk or feeling like I needed to contribute to conversations about things I didn't understand. I stood up, shouldered my bag, and headed toward the door. Professor Emma was still at her desk, organizing papers and shutting down her laptop. She glanced up as I passed, giving me that same slight smile she always did, the one that made me wonder if she could tell I felt out of place. I was almost to the door when I heard her voice behind me. "Jake, could you stay for a moment?" "Yeah." I stopped, my hand already on the door handle. For a second, I considered pretending I hadn't heard her, just pushing through the door and disappearing into the parking lot. But something in her tone made me turn around. It wasn't the formal voice she used during class lectures. It was softer, more personal. "Sure," I said, though my stomach immediately tightened with that familiar anxiety that came whenever I was singled out for anything. In my experience, being asked to stay after class was rarely a good thing. She waited until I walked back toward her desk, and then she did something I wasn't expecting. She got up and walked past me to the door, closing it with a soft click. The sound seemed louder than it should have in the empty classroom. "The real lesson starts now," she said, turning back to face me. I must have looked confused because she smiled and gestured toward one of the chairs near her desk. "Please sit down. I've been wanting to talk to you for weeks." I sat, setting my bag on the floor beside me and trying to figure out what I might have done wrong. Had my last assignment been that bad? I'd written about restoring an old oak dining table that had belonged to my grandmother, trying to capture the way the wood seemed to hold memories in its grain. Professor Emma had given it a B+, which I thought was pretty good for someone who hadn't written anything longer than a grocery list in over a decade. Am I in trouble, I asked, attempting a joke but hearing the genuine nervousness in my voice. Quite the opposite, she said, settling into the chair across from me instead of staying behind her desk. This close, I could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, could smell the faint scent of her perfume, something light and floral that reminded me of the jasmine that grew outside my workshop window. I've been teaching this class for 6 years, she continued, and I've learned to recognize certain things about my students. Most of them are here because they think writing will be easy, or because they need the credits, or because they have romantic notions about being artists. But every once in a while, I get a student who's here for a different reason entirely. She paused, studying my face in a way that made me feel exposed, like she was reading something written there that I didn't even know existed. You're not here because you think this will be easy, she said. In fact, I think you're probably harder on yourself than any of my other students. You sit in the back, you leave quickly, you turn in assignments that are technically proficient but hold back emotionally. You're afraid. The word hung in the air between us. Afraid. It wasn't a word I would have used to describe myself. I'd spent my career working with dangerous tools, climbing ladders, handling heavy materials. I'd started my own business, survived a divorce, rebuilt my life from scratch when everything fell apart 3 years ago. But sitting there under Professor Emma's steady gaze, I realized she was right. Afraid of what? I asked. Of being seen, she said simply. Of letting people know who you really are underneath all that careful control. What am I afraid of? I asked again, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Of being seen, she said simply. Of letting people know who you really are underneath all that careful control. I looked down at my hands, noting the calluses on my palms, the small scar on my thumb from a chisel that had slipped last month. These were working hands, practical hands. They didn't belong to someone who wrote about feelings and explored the deeper meanings of existence. What do you want from me? I asked. I want you to stop hiding, she said. I want you to write something real, something that scares you a little. Not for a grade, not for the class, but for yourself. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic from the parking lot. Students were probably heading to bars or back to their dorm rooms, thinking about weekend plans and upcoming exams. Normal college life, the kind I'd missed out on the first time around because I'd been too focused on getting out and starting my career. I don't know how, I said, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. Emma smiled, and for the first time since I'd started the class, I felt like she was seeing me as more than just another student. That's the beautiful thing about writing, she said. You don't have to know how. You just have to be willing to start. She got up and walked to the whiteboard, picking up a marker and writing something in her neat, precise handwriting. Write about the moment you realized you were pretending to be someone else. That's your assignment, she said, turning back to me. Not for class, not for a grade, for you. Write about that moment. And don't stop until you've told the truth about it. When is it due? I asked. It's not, she said. It's due when you're ready to stop pretending. I picked up my bag, slinging it over my shoulder. The weight of it felt different somehow, heavier with possibility. Professor Emma, I started, then stopped. Can I call you Emma? This feels too personal for the formal thing. She smiled. Emma's fine, and Jake, don't overthink this. Just write. Write like you're talking to someone you trust completely. Someone who won't judge you no matter what you say. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I knew anyone like that. Trust had been a casualty of my divorce, along with a lot of other things I was still learning to rebuild. As I walked toward this door, Emma called my name one more time. Jake, for what it's worth, I think the person you're hiding is probably worth knowing. I left the classroom with those words echoing in my head, walking through the quiet hallways and out into the cool evening air. The parking lot was mostly empty now, just a few cars scattered under the yellow streetlights. My truck sat in the far corner where I always parked it, away from the newer cars that belonged to students who probably had parents paying their tuition. The drive home was different than usual. Instead of letting my mind wander to tomorrow's projects or weekend plans, I found myself thinking about Emma's assignment. Write about the moment you realized you were pretending to be someone else. When had that been? When had I started hiding? I thought about high school, about being the kid who was good with his hands but struggled with algebra. I thought about my first year of college, feeling lost among students who seemed to know exactly what they wanted to do with their lives. I thought about meeting Lisa, about how she'd seemed so confident, so sure of herself, and how I tried to become the kind of person I thought she wanted. But maybe it had started even earlier than that. Maybe it had started when my dad taught me that real men didn't talk about their feelings, that you showed love through actions, not words. Maybe it had started when I learned that being reliable and steady and uncomplicated was the way to earn approval, even if it meant burying parts of myself that didn't fit that image. Back in my apartment, I sat at the small desk I'd built myself, the one that faced the window overlooking the street. I pulled out a notebook, not the one I used for class assignments, but an old leather-bound journal that Lisa had given me years ago. I'd never written in it, had always felt like my thoughts weren't important enough to commit to paper. I stared at the blank page for a long time, Emma's words echoing in my mind. Write like you're talking to someone you trust completely. The problem was, I wasn't sure I trusted anyone completely anymore, including myself. But maybe that was the point. Maybe trust was something you had to practice, like any other skill. Maybe you started by trusting yourself enough to be honest on paper, even if you weren't ready to be honest with anyone else. I picked up my pen and started writing. The moment I realized I was pretending to be someone else was a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years ago. Lisa had already left for work, and I was standing in our kitchen making coffee the way I always did when I caught my reflection in the window above the sink. For just a second, I didn't recognize the person looking back at me. It wasn't that I looked different physically. I was still the same guy I'd always been, still had the same brown hair that never wanted to lie flat, still had the same blue eyes that my mother always said were my best feature. But there was something in that reflection, something in the way I was holding myself that felt like a stranger. I was wearing the shirt Lisa had bought me for Christmas, the one she said made me look more professional. I was drinking coffee from the mug she'd picked out because it matched our kitchen colors. I was standing in the kitchen of the house we bought together, in the neighborhood she'd chosen because it was up and coming, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd made a decision based on what I actually wanted. The words kept coming, flowing out of me faster than I'd expected. I wrote about the slow erosion of my own preferences, the way I'd gradually stopped voicing opinions that might create conflict. I wrote about the morning I'd realized I didn't even know what kind of music I liked anymore, because I'd been listening to Lisa's playlists for so long. I wrote about the projects I'd stopped taking on because they didn't fit the image of the successful businessman she wanted me to become. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the streetlights outside had gone dark and the first hints of dawn were creeping across the sky. When I finally stopped, I had filled nearly 20 pages with handwriting that grew increasingly loose and urgent as the night wore on. Reading back over what I'd written, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. It was like coming up for air after being underwater for too long, like finally taking a full breath after months of shallow breathing. The words on the page weren't perfect, weren't polished or carefully crafted, but they were true. They were mine in a way that nothing had been mine in a long time. I closed the notebook and sat back in my chair, feeling exhausted and exhilarated at the same time. Emma had been right. I had been hiding, not just from other people, but from myself. I'd been so focused on being the person I thought I should be that I'd lost track of who I actually was underneath all those expectations. The next few days passed in a strange haze. I went to work, completed my projects, met with clients, but part of my mind was always elsewhere, turning over the things I'd written, the realizations that had emerged from those pages. I found myself paying attention to moments when I felt like myself versus moments when I felt like I was performing some version of myself for other people's benefit. It was surprising how often I was performing. With clients, I was the competent professional who never doubted his abilities. With my parents, I was the successful son who had his life together. With friends, I was the reliable guy who never needed anything from anyone. Even alone, I sometimes caught myself maintaining these facades, as if I'd forgotten how to just be without an audience. Thursday's class came and went without Emma mentioning our conversation. She taught about point of view, about the difference between what a narrator knows and what they're willing to reveal. I found myself thinking about my own point of view, about all the things I knew about myself but had never been willing to reveal, even to myself. After class, as students filed out and I gathered my things, Emma caught my eye and nodded slightly. It was barely a gesture, but I understood. She was asking if I'd done the assignment, if I'd taken that step into honesty she'd challenged me to take. I nodded back, and something passed between us, some acknowledgement that something had shifted. I wasn't the same person who tried to slip out quietly the week before. I wasn't sure who I was yet, but I was beginning to find out. The following week, I found myself arriving to class a few minutes early instead of rushing in at the last second. I chose a seat closer to the front, not in the back corner where I'd been hiding. When Emma asked for volunteers to read their work aloud, I surprised myself by raising my hand. The piece I read wasn't the one I'd written that night after our conversation. That one felt too raw, too personal to share with a room full of people I barely knew. Instead, I read something I'd written about my grandfather, about the summer I'd spent with him when I was 12, learning to use his tools and listening to his stories about building houses that would last for generations. But even in that safer piece, something had changed. I wrote about the way my grandfather's hands looked when he showed me how to hold a chisel, about the pride in his eyes when I completed my first dovetail joint. I wrote about the feeling of creating something with my own hands, something that hadn't existed before I made it. And I wrote about how that feeling had gotten buried over the years under layers of practicality and other people's expectations. When I finished reading, the classroom was quiet for a moment. Then Emma smiled, and I saw something in her expression that I hadn't seen before. It was approval, but more than that, it was recognition. "That's beautiful, Jake," she said. "You can hear the love in every sentence. The love for your grandfather, for the craft, for that version of yourself who was still discovering what he was capable of." One of the younger students, a girl named Sarah who usually wrote poetry about her complicated relationship with her mother, raised her hand. "I liked how you made us feel like we were there," she said, "like we could smell the sawdust and feel how proud you were when you got it right." Other students nodded, offering their own observations about the sensory details, the emotional honesty, the way the piece had made them think about their own relationships with older family members. For the first time since I'd started the class, I felt like I belonged in that room. After class, as students gathered their things and headed out, Emma approached my desk. "That was quite different from your earlier work," she said. "I took your advice," I said, "about not hiding." "I can tell. How did it feel?" I thought about the question, trying to find words for something I was still processing. "Scary," I said finally, "but also like I was remembering something I'd forgotten about myself." Emma nodded. "That's exactly what good writing should do. It should help you remember who you are when you're not trying to be anyone else." She paused, seeming to consider something, then made a decision. "Jake, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you can say no without any impact on your grade or our working relationship." I waited, curious about what she might ask. "I'm working on a project," she said, "a collection of essays about people who've made significant life changes, who found the courage to become more authentic versions of themselves. I think your story, your journey from hiding to honesty, could be a powerful addition to that collection." The suggestion caught me completely off guard. "You want me to write about myself for publication?" "I want you to consider it," she said. "Not the assignment you wrote that night necessarily, but something that builds on it. Something that explores what it means to stop pretending, to start living as who you really are instead of who you think you should be." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Writing something that personal, that honest, and then letting strangers read it felt like standing naked in front of a crowd. But there was something appealing about it too, something that felt like the logical next step in whatever journey I'd started that night in the empty classroom. "I'll think about it," I said. "That's all I ask," she said. "And Jake, whatever you decide, I'm proud of the progress you've made. You're not the same person who tried to sneak out of here a few weeks ago." That weekend, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I went to the bookstore, not to pick up a manual about woodworking techniques or home improvement, but to browse the literature section. I pulled books off the shelves at random, reading first paragraphs and jacket descriptions, looking for something that might help me understand what Emma saw in writing, what made it worth pursuing. I ended up buying 3 books: a collection of essays by a carpenter-turned-writer who wrote about the intersection of craft and creativity, a memoir by a man who'd left his corporate job to become a furniture maker, and a novel about a middle-aged man learning to be honest about his feelings for the first time in his life. Reading them felt like discovering a language I'd always known but never learned to speak. These writers were talking about things I'd felt but never articulated, experiences I'd had but never examined. They wrote about the satisfaction of creating something with your hands, about the way physical work could be a form of meditation, about the courage it took to live authentically in a world that rewarded conformity. But more than that, they wrote about the cost of hiding, about what happened to a person when they spent too much energy maintaining a facade. They wrote about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only knew the version of you that you thought they wanted to see. I started carrying a notebook with me, jotting down observations and thoughts throughout the day. I wrote about the way morning light looked different when I paid attention to it, about conversations with clients that revealed more about me than I had intended, about moments when I caught myself being genuinely myself instead of performing some version of myself. The writing wasn't always good, wasn't always profound or insightful. Sometimes it was just notes about the weather or descriptions of projects I was working on, but it was honest, and that felt revolutionary after years of carefully curating every thought and feeling before expressing it. One evening, as I was working late in my shop, sanding a tabletop that would become part of a dining set for a young couple who just bought their first house, I found myself thinking about Emma's project. What would I say if I wrote about my journey from hiding to authenticity? What would that story look like? I thought about the moment in the kitchen when I hadn't recognized my own reflection. I thought about the slow realization that I'd been living someone else's life, making someone else's choices, pursuing someone else's dreams. I thought about the night I'd written 20 pages without stopping, about the feeling of finally telling the truth after years of careful editing. But I also thought about what came after that moment of recognition, the hard work of figuring out who I actually was underneath all those layers of pretense, the process of learning to make decisions based on my own preferences instead of what I thought other people wanted, the challenge of building relationships based on authenticity instead of performance. It was messy, complicated work. There were days when I missed the simplicity of just being who people expected me to be, when the effort of being genuine felt exhausting. But there were also moments of pure joy, moments when I felt completely aligned with myself, when my actions and words and thoughts all pointed in the same direction. The couple I was making the dining set for had been by earlier that week to check on the progress. They were probably 5 years younger than me, full of excitement about their new house and their future together. As I showed them the grain pattern in the wood, explained how I'd chosen each piece to complement the others, I found myself talking about the craft in a way I never had before. It's not just about making something functional, I heard myself saying. It's about creating something that will be part of their lives, part of their story. Every scratch and mark that accumulates over the years will be evidence of the life lived around it. The woman had looked at me with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such philosophy from someone she'd hired to make furniture. But her husband had nodded, understanding immediately what I was trying to say. That's exactly what we want, he'd said. Something that will grow more beautiful as we grow older together. After they left, I'd realized that I'd been talking about more than just furniture. I'd been talking about the kind of life I was trying to build for myself, one that would grow more authentic and meaningful over time, instead of more polished and artificial. That realization became the seed of the essay I started writing for Emma's collection. I wrote about the dining table I was creating, but I also wrote about the process of creating a life that felt genuinely mine. I wrote about the tools required for both kinds of creation: patience, attention to detail, willingness to start over when something wasn't working, faith that the end result would be worth the effort. The writing came easier this time, flowing out of me with less resistance than I'd expected. Maybe it was because I'd been practicing honesty in smaller doses, building up my tolerance for vulnerability, the way you might build up physical strength through regular exercise. I wrote about the morning I'd realized I was pretending, but I also wrote about all the small moments since then when I'd chosen authenticity over performance. The day I'd told a client that I thought their design idea wouldn't work instead of just going along with it to avoid conflict. The evening I'd called my parents and admitted that I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. That maybe success wasn't just about financial stability and social approval. When the essay was finished, it was 15 pages long. and felt like the most honest thing I'd ever written. Reading it back, I could hear my own voice in every sentence, not the careful, professional voice I used with clients or the agreeable voice I used with friends, but the voice that emerged when I was alone with my thoughts and didn't have to perform for anyone. I printed it out and put it in a manila envelope, then carried it around for 3 days before I worked up the courage to give it to Emma. When I finally handed it to her after class, my hands were actually shaking. "Are you nervous about me reading this?" she asked, noticing my anxiety. "Terrified," I admitted. "Good," she said, smiling. "That means it's real." She called me 2 days later, asking if I could meet her for coffee to discuss the essay. We arranged to meet at a small cafe near the college, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, the kind of place I would have avoided before because it seemed too bohemian for someone like me. Emma was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with my essay spread out in front of her, covered in notes written in her precise handwriting. She looked up as I approached, and I could tell immediately from her expression that she'd been moved by what I'd written. "Jake," she said as I sat down across from her, "this is extraordinary." I felt a flush of pride mixed with embarrassment. "It's probably too personal," I said. "Too much information about my marriage, my family, all that stuff." "No," she said firmly. "The personal details are what make it universal. Every person who reads this is going to recognize themselves in your story because everyone has experienced that moment of realizing they've been pretending to be someone else." She flipped through the pages, pointing to the specific passages she'd marked. "This part where you write about learning to make decisions based on your own preferences instead of what everyone wanted. This is something everyone struggles with. And this section about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only know the version of you that you think they want to see, this is profound." We spent the next hour going through the essay line by line, discussing places where I could expand on certain ideas, moments where I could dig even deeper into the emotional truth of the experience. Emma's feedback wasn't just about the technical aspects of the writing, though she offered plenty of suggestions about structure and pacing. She was helping me understand how to make my personal story speak to universal human experiences. "There's one thing I want to ask you about," she said as we neared the end of our discussion. "The ending feels a little too neat, too resolved. The truth is that this work of becoming authentic, of learning to live as who you really are, it's never finished. It's an ongoing process." She was right. I'd ended the essay with a sense of arrival, as if I'd figured everything out and was now living happily ever after as my authentic self. But the reality was messier than that. There were still days when I caught myself slipping back into old patterns, still moments when I chose the safe response over the honest one. "How do I write about something that's still happening?" I asked. "You write about the process," she said. "You write about what you've learned so far, and you acknowledge that there's still more to learn. You write about the ongoing choice to keep showing up as yourself, even when it's difficult." As we finished our coffee and prepared to leave, Emma asked me something I wasn't expecting. "Jake, can I ask you a personal question?" I nodded, curious what she wanted to know. "What made you decide to take this class?" Really, not the surface reason about wanting to explore your creative side, but the deeper reason. I thought about her question, trying to identify the moment when I decided I needed something different in my life. "I think," I said slowly, "I was tired of feeling like a stranger to myself. I'd built this life that looked successful from the outside, but it didn't feel like mine." Emma nodded, understanding immediately what I meant. "And now?" she asked. "Now I'm still figuring it out," I said. "But at least I'm figuring out who I actually am instead of who I think I should be. It's scarier, but it's also more alive." That conversation became the new ending of my essay. Instead of presenting myself as someone who had solved the problem of authenticity, I wrote about the ongoing nature of the work, the daily choice to keep showing up honestly, even when it would be easier to retreat into familiar patterns of performance. When the essay was published 6 months later as part of Emma's collection, I was amazed by the response it generated. People wrote to tell me that reading about my experience had helped them recognize their own patterns of hiding, had given them permission to start the difficult work of becoming more authentic. A man my age wrote to say that my description of not recognizing himself in the kitchen window had perfectly captured a moment he'd experienced but never been able to articulate. A woman in her 40s said that reading about my journey had inspired her to finally leave a job that was slowly killing her spirit, even though everyone around her thought she was crazy to give up the security. But the response that meant the most to me came from my father. He called me after reading the essay, something he'd never done before. Usually our conversations were initiated by my mother, with my father taking the phone only after she'd covered all the important family news. "Son," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I read that thing you wrote." I waited, not sure what to expect. My father had never been one for discussing feelings or personal growth. "I want you to know," he continued, "that I'm proud of you for having the courage to write all that down. And I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like you had to hide who you really were." It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and it opened the door to a different kind of relationship between us. We started talking more regularly, not just about practical things like work and weather, but about ideas and feelings and the challenges of trying to live authentically in a world that often rewarded conformity. The success of the essay led to other opportunities. Emma introduced me to an editor who was looking for writers who could bridge the gap between blue-collar experience and literary expression. I started writing regularly about the intersection of craft and creativity, about what physical work could teach us about living authentically. But more than the external recognition, the process of writing had changed something fundamental about how I moved through the world. I was more present in my daily life, more attentive to my own thoughts and feelings, more willing to speak up when something didn't feel right. I was also more open to connection with other people. When you stop hiding who you are, it becomes easier to see and appreciate who other people really are. My friendships deepened, my relationships with clients became more meaningful, and I found myself part of a community of people who valued authenticity over performance. Looking back now, I can see that the moment Emma closed that classroom door and said, "The real lesson starts now," was a turning point in my life. She'd recognized something in me that I hadn't been able to see in myself, and she'd had the courage to challenge me to dig deeper, to stop hiding behind the safe facade I'd constructed. The real lesson, it turned out, wasn't about writing technique or literary analysis. It was about the courage to be honest, first with yourself and then with the world. It was about the ongoing work of becoming who you actually are instead of who you think you should be. That work continues every day. There are still moments when I catch myself slipping back into old patterns. Still times when I choose the safe response over the honest one. But now I recognize those moments for what they are, and I have the tools to course correct, to choose authenticity over performance. "The real lesson starts now," Emma had said, and she was right. It starts now and it starts again tomorrow. And it will keep starting for as long as I have the courage to keep choosing honesty over hiding, authenticity over performance, truth over safety. That's the lesson I'm still learning. The one that began in an empty classroom with a teacher who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. It's the most important lesson I've ever learned. And I'm grateful every day that I was brave enough finally to stop trying to leave quietly and start showing up as who I really am. The story of Jake and Professor Emma delivers a profound life lesson. True growth begins when we stop hiding our authentic selves and embrace the vulnerability of being seen, allowing us to rebuild lives that truly reflect who we are. Jake's attempt to slip out quietly after class symbolizes years of pretending, crafting a practical facade to meet others' expectations while bearing his creative spirit. Emma's closing of the door and her words, "The real lesson starts now," forced him to confront his fears, challenging him to write honestly and unearth the emotional depths he'd long suppressed. This journey from performance to authenticity highlights how self-deception leads to isolation, while honesty fosters deeper connections and fulfillment. Jake's transformation, through writing, self-reflection, and sharing his story, shows that acknowledging our true selves, even when terrifying, unlocks creativity, stronger relationships, and a sense of purpose. It's an emotional reminder that life's most valuable lessons often come from mentors who see our potential and push us beyond comfort zones, teaching us that authenticity isn't a one-time achievement, but a daily practice of choosing truth over safety. Have you ever had a moment when someone challenged you to reveal your true self, leading to profound change? What's a time you stopped pretending and embraced authenticity? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone to take that brave step. If Jake's journey resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more tales of self-discovery and growth. Join our community of seekers who value honest living. Your support keeps these inspiring narratives alive. Let's encourage each other to live boldly and authentically.